Okay.
Good morning from my basement, an interview with line editor David Sharp. David was, as pretty much anyone involved with Ars Magica knows, involved with producing 40 books for 5th edition. But in addition to that, he was, of course, a key figure in the 4th edition and in the redesign of the magic system, I believe. So let's start with just saying hello to David, who's joining us today all the way from Japan. Good morning, David.
Good morning, or whatever time of day it is where you're listening to this.
It's afternoon for you, I believe, and quite early morning here in Sunday. Now, one of the things I've noticed while putting together a virtual conference, which was, well, this year was an unusual one because Grand Tribunal was obviously held, much to my horror, because I was terrified of people becoming sick and I have a contamination phobia. So it really was quite frightening for me. But because people insisted, it went ahead, and there were about 15 of us in 3 bubbles who played games. And we were actually a very limited number of households because we have a habit at Grand Tribunal now of coupling up. So we have quite a few young couples have met at Grand Tribunal over the years. It's unusual, isn't it? Ars Magica is a force for romance, but there you go.
Yes, that's not what I would initially have thought.
No, as of because of that, because of various other things, we were able to actually hold it at Gas Green, and no one died. And partly that was because I wouldn't have held it 2 weeks later, and I wouldn't have held it 2 weeks before. But at the time we held the convention, our coronavirus figures had reached their absolute nadir, and the British government were trying to encourage us to open up. And therefore, the local health authority refused to allow me to cancel in a manner that would allow insurance to come to play for people who were coming from Norway. And 2 days before we actually held the convention, the Norwegians had to cancel because the status changed in their country. Anyway, enough of all this. Because of that, we decided we'd hold an online convention this year. And when we were organising it, I suddenly discovered that Ars Magica fans do not live in one time zone. They live in almost every time zone, from the Russias through to the Americas, from South America through all of Europe to Australia, New Zealand, and now Japan. Yeah. So is Ars Magica big in Japan, David?
I don't think it's big in Japan. I have actually played it in Japan, although that was years ago now, with a group of people who had an ongoing saga here. So it's not unknown in Japan, but no, not big. You have to read English quite well to play it.
Right. Yeah, and never a Japanese edition.
There's never been a Japanese translation. There was talk about it at one point, but it never came to anything.
Is that not something that you would be interested in doing? I would have thought that would have been something that you'd be ideally placed to do.
You have no idea how bad my Japanese is.
I know how bad my Danish is, and I've been trying to learn that for 50 years. So I'm sure your Japanese is.
I couldn't do the translation into Japanese, so we need to get somebody else to do it, and it would be a lot of work for probably very limited return. So I'm not sure it's the best.
I know that. Yeah, but Call of Cthulhu is a very successful game in Japan.
It is, yes.
It makes me wonder. I suppose the real problem would be that the actual Mythic Europe setting would have. Actually, would Mythic Europe appeal in Japan?
It might. There is, I think it's still live, a Kickstarter for a Japanese translation of a Mythic Roman Empire game that was originally written in Italian. So the Japanese are as fond of European settings as Western gamers are of Japanese settings. So,
right. But
usually that's accurate.
Yes, but less worried about the notion of cultural appropriation. So
yes, not a big thing here.
No. So I really wish I could do something about my hair this morning, but it simply refuses to lie down. I suspect I slept in something. But anyway, I washed my hair before I went to bed. That's why. Okay.
Yeah,
right. So This morning, I've got the pleasure of bringing to you an interview with David Chart, and David was line editor for the legendary 5th edition, the current edition of Ars Magica. Good morning, David. How did you get involved with Ars Magica, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, we start with when I got started playing it.
Yeah.
It was the review of 1st edition in Dragon magazine, which made it sound absolutely fantastic, unsurprisingly. And also, it was difficult to get hold of in the UK. I finally ordered it direct from Esdevium because this was a very long time ago, and Esdevium still did consumer mail order. But by the time I got it, the 2nd edition had come out. So my 1st edition of Ars Magica was actually the 2nd edition, the one true edition as it used to be. Not anymore.
Right. Okay. So I was living in Bury St Edmunds back then, and I used to get Imagine magazine and White Dwarf. My mother would buy them, but one month she picked up a copy of Dragon for me, thinking it looks like my kind of thing. I found the review of Ars Magica, and I was able to order a copy as well. And we never played it because the review was fantastic. That was where I first saw it, but we never played it. And there were many, many games in those days, and instead people decided that Rollmaster seemed like the way to go. So I was to come back to the game many years later, but I saw that same review in the back of Dragon. It was only a short text review. I don't even remember there being a picture, but it was.
I think there was, because I think I was surprised by the cover of the book that I got. So I think there must have been.
Right, so there must have been one, yeah. What interested me was the idea that Wizards spent their downtime planning what they did, and it sounded fascinating. And yeah, so that was about 88, I think, wasn't it?
Around then, yes. It may just have been 87. It was 88 by the time I had it, or 89. Yeah.
Yeah, it was right about 87, 88, because I was just off to university. So you must have been a very young man. How old were you when you started Ars Magica?
I was in the 6th form.
Ah, okay. So
17,
how come you look? So you're actually almost the same age as me. You just look far, far younger. That's how unreasonable of you. Tell me the secret of your longevity, Rachel. Okay, so moving on. You got the game, and did you set up a saga immediately?
Not immediately, no, because I didn't have a group at that point. I didn't actually set up my first saga until I was at university, so which was only a couple of years later. And then that ran, well, the same group ran until basically I left Cambridge, so 10 years or so. And then I switched to another saga with Neil Taylor, Sheila Thomas, and Phil Masters in it, all of whom wrote for 4th and it actually all wrote for 4th and 5th edition. Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
So yes, played for a while there, and then came to Japan, and as I say, played briefly in a saga shortly after I got here, but didn't get to play very much after that. So
okay, well, what I've been doing recently is playing more and more online. Is there much interest in online gaming in Japan at the moment, or?
I don't know, actually. My contact with the Japanese role-playing community is limited, so
right,
not non-existent actually,
yeah.
But definitely limited.
Yeah, it's been a feature this year. I ran 9 games at Gen Con, which is certainly something that would not have happened in the past. And I've been running an Ars Magica saga that involves 4 different covenants, 22 players at the moment, 22 players. One of the covenants folded early, having been destroyed by a visit from another one of the covenants by accident. But they're different groups playing in different time zones using the same setting. And so red caps have become far more important because people are emailing me mail and I'm passing it from one covenant to another. And because of the shared
I hope the
setting,
red caps are incorrupt and delivering all the mail properly.
there's only 2 player character red cap, so I don't think there's much danger of corruption just yet. But in fact, the one group have just gone to the Mercer House in London. But it's quite an interesting experience to run a large-scale campaign. The only thing is that it means that I'm dedicating 16 hours of my week to running Ars Magica. So, but
I think that is more hours than I dedicated to running Ars Magica in the sense of running the game line. So,
yeah, 16 hours refereeing. There's the prep time as well. So, and then the fact that the players insist on using 40 different books, and for some reason they all decide they're going to specialize in some obscure thing that you only find in one book. One of them's busily involved in fertility magic, for example. What kind of a line editor would produce a line with so many core books that, or so many books that players can fall upon that? Yeah. So how did it happen? Come on, tell the story. How did I end up with this nightmare of 40 rule books to look upon?
I wanted to produce books that players would use, and I didn't consider the situation of a single story guide with 40 players. So I did kind of assume that no story guide would have to use all 40 of them at the same time. The plan for the books was always to make them all appealing and useful to players, on the assumption that some of them would not appeal to particular players, but that they would all appeal to somebody. And if you wanted to do a particular niche in Ars Magica, there would be a book for you by the end of the line. And we really got to that point, which is one of the reasons why I wound it up. So it was generally strategically planned. Most of the books for Ars Magica 5th edition, I set the themes and then called for authors. There were just a handful where authors came to me and said, hey, we'd like to do this book, and it fitted. And so I think the first one of those was Neil Christie saying, I'd like to do a Middle East and North Africa book. And I said, not in one book, try the Middle East first. But that was 3 books in the end.
Yeah, and very large books as well.
And they were all large books. And he did say at the end, I'm so glad you persuaded me this was not one book. So generally it was strategic. The idea was to make everything useful, and I'm very glad that that worked, and very sorry that you have to use all of them at the same time.
No, it's not the case, actually, because of the tribunal books, most of them obviously don't come into play. So that takes out... Did you produce 8 tribunal books in the end? If we include the 3 Middle Eastern and North African ones, maybe 10.
Maybe 10, yeah. I'd have to actually count, but it'd be something like that, because we did most of the tribunals. Yeah.
So therefore, it is my because you didn't do Iberia, Rome, or
Lochlevine, Stonehenge. I think actually those are the ones we didn't.
Those are the ones
Novgorod.
you didn't do.
Novgorod and Levant.
And
Novgorod and Levant, because they both had
4th edition
tribunal books. So
yeah,
we did everything that didn't have a tribunal book already.
Yeah. Though you never produced a book improving Scandinavia, because the 4th edition take on Scandinavia is really quite. It's better than
it was. Africa was a higher priority, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Africa and the Middle East were higher priorities, so it didn't get done.
I have always wanted to run an African campaign. I'm thinking about running a Middle Eastern campaign. I spent the lockdown here we had a couple of months where we couldn't go out, so I decided to learn Arabic. So I bought a bunch of textbooks and set about teaching myself Arabic. And I already knew a little bit of Quranic Arabic, but I'm getting better now. I'm probably better, and ironically, I'm now better at Arabic than I am at Danish. So,
well, there you go. You have to run a North African or Middle Eastern campaign then.
Yeah, and
in Arabic.
Well, I did try. One of my ideas was that I could translate the Grand Tribunal website into Arabic and invite anyone Arabic-speaking players, but obviously it's a fairly limited base in Cheltenham. So I then tried to teach myself some Gujarati, but I haven't got very far with that yet. So I'm still working on that. But there you go. At least I'm enthusiastic, hey?
Enthusiasm is very important.
Yeah, yeah. And try running games in languages you can actually converse in rather than merely ask the way to the shops in is also important.
Yeah, that's also helpful. The vocabulary is slightly non-standard.
Yeah, though fortunately Quranic Arabic, the Quran does have a lot of very useful language in it for running this kind of game. You'd be surprised how many words there are for bewitched. Sahara means bewitched. There you go. So, or Sahara, depending on how you pronounce it. Which the wonderful thing about Arabic is it's spoken in so many different nations and so many different dialects that whatever way I mispronounce it, it doesn't matter, because someone somewhere will probably pronounce it that way.
Moving around the Arab-speaking world from word to word as you go through a sentence.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
Mobile accent.
In the same sentence. Yeah. The accent varies wildly. Okay, so moving on from that. 40 books were produced and we came to an end, and people have lamented that end and suggested what should have been done and what could have been done, and ever since. And there was a great deal of enthusiasm for a 6th edition, but whether it will ever happen or not. Things like Magic Shoe were mooted. Cam came and went. Justin Alexander's here now. Do you still have much contact with Atlas Games?
Occasional contacts, not a great deal because we're not working on anything together, but I'm still basically in touch, but not close level.
I hear occasionally from John and Michelle, and they seem to be doing well and everyone's happy, so that's great. And they're doing well with the board game section, and the role-playing games are coming on as well, I understand.
Yes.
So yeah, so moving on from that, let's go on. So what have you done since Ars Magica other than in the world of role-playing? Because you were always writing for other people. White Wolf you've written for over the years, and Wizards of the Coast, have you written for them?
I've not done a huge amount in the world of role-playing since I stopped doing Ars Magica because it pays really badly.
Yes.
So I have been doing some community content stuff for the new edition of Torg, because for some reason that grabbed me and I started writing for it, and that also pays extremely badly, but it's been fun.
Actually, you did this. Were you on the cyber papacy, or are you on one of the other settings? Because can you explain Torg quickly for those who've never heard of it? Because I like
Torg. Torg was originally released in the early 90s, and the idea is that half a dozen role-playing games have invaded Earth, and you can move from one game to another by getting on a ship, or even an aeroplane. But because aeroplanes don't work in all of the role-playing games, you have to be a bit careful about that sort of thing. And there's a back plot about possibility raiders and high lords and the forces of the void and eternity.
The Earth has been attacked from different dimensions, I believe, is the actual way.
Basically, attacked by from different realities. So depending on where you are, how much magic works, how much technology works, how much miracles work varies. But you play characters who have a particular connection to reality, so they can make their own tricks work anywhere. Most of the time, your particular tricks stopping working in the middle of an adventure is one of the classic things to go wrong for the group in Torg. So there are, it covers virtually all the genres.
Characters come from different genres, is that right? They come from different.
Yes.
And there's the. Can you just quickly, are there 9 of them? I'm trying to remember back to the 90s. I remember dinosaurs and I remember the cyber papacy, but I thought there were 9 of them.
Okay, there's dinosaurs, cyber papacy, fantasy, horror, spy, intrigue type things, post-apocalyptic horror type stuff.
Egyptology, pulp, something like that.
Yeah, pulp with an Egyptian flavor. I think that's I think that's all the ones that they have in the corner. Oh, and in the new version, Earth is cinematic Earth. So Die Hard and The Craft rather than just ordinary, boring, mundane Earth, because one of the problems with the first edition of Torg was that characters from core Earth, who were obviously very appealing because that's sort of us, were boring, were incredibly boring, because all the cool stuff was in all the other realities. So right. They've changed that around a bit. So yes, I've been writing some stuff for that on their community content things, and I will send you some affiliate links so that you can stick them in the description for the video and people can click on them and buy my stuff for a game they don't play. But hey.
No, I haven't played Torg. Torg used to have cards involved. Does it still have cards?
It still has cards, yes. Right. It does have some very nice and creative mechanics involved.
And it was all available on Bundle of Holdings, so it probably will be again at some point in the old edition, but was there a new edition?
Yeah, there is a new edition. There is a new edition which has done very well on crowdfunding and is now through about 5 of the different genres and still going. So it's still been, making good amounts of money. So the next one at least is going to happen. The next one due is the horror setting. So.
Oh, excellent. So it is a popular setting. It was one of those games that was never, I mean, in the 1990s, my experience was that role-playing locally in the UK, my part of the UK, was overwhelmed by a wave of World of Darkness products, which were in those days very high production, glossy, and they seemed to appeal to a huge number of the uni students who were around at the time. So naturally, being a contrarian, I went off and played Ars Magica, which was almost World of Darkness, but never quite. So... No. No, mechanically very different.
Yeah, mechanically extremely different, yes. Yeah. Yes, I did play World of Darkness at that point because I was a uni student. Yeah.
Ah, who wasn't? The problem I had with it was that I've owned goodness knows how many different editions of Vampire now, but I've never actually managed to run it, possibly because I've never had the time, because I've dedicated so many years to running Ars. Anyway, Ars obviously became something of a passion for me and for yourself, and you went on to become line editor after the predecessor was Jerome Dumont. Is that right?
No, he was never line editor. I'm trying to remember if I was immediately after Damelin. I think I was. Damelin Kimbrough was line editor.
Of course.
Jeff Tidball did the first of 4th edition, then he stopped, although I think he's actually still involved with Atlas, but he stopped doing Ars Magica. Damelin Kimbrough took over, and then I think I took over immediately after him.
That's what confused me. Sorry, Damelin moved to France, didn't he? And
then that's right.
Yeah, I'd forgotten all of that, but that's why I thought it was somebody else like Jerome, but no, it was Damelin Kimbrough.
Who was French. Yes.
Who was French, and he returned to France, and then there was a slight hiatus, and you took over as acting line editor, and then became line editor, and that was when things changed. Now, on 4th Ed, were you involved in the redesign of the magic system then? Because that was the redesign of range, duration, target. In fact, pretty much the modern Ars Magica system dates from 4th Ed, as far as I'm concerned. The earlier system is far closer to something like Mage, isn't it? In some ways, it's far more hand wavy.
Yeah.
How on earth did you manage to do that? Because it must have been to actually make the spells make sense and follow a scale must have taken an incredible amount of work.
I was at uni. Yes, it did take quite a lot of work. I think I did the basic design for the spell system. I did the groundwork for that, and then we split the various forms between different secret masters, and I can't remember how many I did. I probably still have the files on my computer somewhere because I don't throw any of that away, but I only did about half of the the perform adaptations for 4th edition. But yes, that was difficult. But the reason I did it was I've been running a 3rd edition saga, and my players pointed out to me that I had taken exactly the same spell and made it level 25 at one point, and then 6 months later made it level 40. And I thought at that point, I thought maybe we need slightly more specific guidelines for this, because that's a bit too much variation for a game where making your own new spells is supposed to be an important activity for player characters.
Absolutely. And it was the thing that really, I mean, people used to say that it was the finest Magic system ever created. That was before 4th edition. But those people then later on in reviews often said, well, there are now many other verb noun Magic systems, and, you know, it's getting looking dead. No, absolutely not. The 4th edition revision makes it a magnificently organized game. And it deals with players like Luke, apologies, Luke, if you're listening to this, who will argue with me until the cows come home that a spell should be 10 levels lower than I believe it is. So,
yes.
But yeah, it's absolutely the way of, and the playtesting, again, it shows a kind of methodological rigor. Were you any by chance, when you were at Cambridge, were you very influenced by Popper? You know,
my PhD is in philosophy of science.
Right. I just wondered if you were an empiricist with a kind of Popperian, you know, experimental bias, because, yeah, I mean, as you probably guessed, my favorite philosopher of science. Can you guess who my favorite philosopher of science is?
Carl Gustav Hempel.
No,
is that wrong?
Paul Feyerabend. However you say it, Feyerabend. Have you read
yes.
Against Method? Yeah.
Against Method, yes.
Yeah, if you've ever read Against Method, then you'll understand quite where I'm coming from in most of my approaches. So yeah, the whole demarcation debate and his kind of desire to bring anarchy into science.
Yes.
Anyway, so yeah, there's a great deal of methodological rigor in your writing style, and it's and with the whole playtesting. Would you like to describe the playtesting? Because I think that's what made it as well. I'd like to think us playtesters had an effect.
Oh, I think the playtesting definitely had an effect. Okay, so the basic playtesting system for 5th edition supplements was the authors would write a first draft. I would read the draft and ask for revisions. That would then go out to playtest. We would then look at the playtest reports and discuss what revisions needed to be made, make those revisions, send that out for playtest, look at the next set of playtest reports, make the necessary revisions, and if those were substantial, it would go out for playtest again, until we reached a level where either we were all so sick of this manuscript that we were about to kill each other. One author, on one of the longer and more difficult texts, one author did say, I'm finished, I'm never writing for Ars Magica again, which lasted until I sent him, well, there is this call coming up. Okay, no, I'll write for that one. So, yeah, but basically until we were only making minor revisions based on the playtesters' comments, we kept going round. So I had to have a substantial buffer of finished manuscripts so that basically a book could be a year later than originally planned in its production cycle and still be released on its original slot, which happened a couple of times.
I remember the first me and Neil working on the Mysteries Revised edition right at the beginning. That was a astonishingly strange experience. But after that, we split down into that wonderful time when everything seemed to go through 2 playtest rounds, apart from 1 or 2 books, which went through 5. And that sometimes happens. Yeah. And often the problem there was built in because obviously in any role-playing game, there will be some topics which are inherently difficult because the role-playing game kind of militates against telling stories about them structurally. Apprentices for ours is one of them, because they have this
Yes.
whole horrible habit of well, the way the gift works and things like that just makes it difficult to handle
Yes.
Twilight.
Apprentices was a book that was going to be my example of a book that was far harder to get right than I thought it was going to be when we started. And one of the other ones that was difficult was the Magic Realm book, but I always expected that one to be tough because it's difficult topics, fundamental to the game. I thought, right, this is going to take a while to get right, and it did. Apprentices, I really did not expect to be as tough as it turned out to be. I'm very pleased with the final version, but that was hard work.
It's a good book. It's a good book, and I've used it quite a bit. The Fairies book actually was one of those that came together remarkably quickly, as far as I can see. It seems to have been because it's got a very strong take by Timothy, and it's a very direct line on. It's very different to the previous edition, the John Sneed one.
Yes.
So, and I really like it. Though it took me a long time to understand that take. And when I suddenly thought one day, stop thinking this in terms of fairy lore, Chris, and start thinking in terms of ufology. And then suddenly, to me, because of my background, it all fell into place instantly.
Yeah.
The
thing that I really liked about Timothy's take on fairies was that it hit all of the boxes. They were alien, they were dangerous, but they weren't evil.
And they weren't magic. They were clearly distinct.
They weren't magic. They were clearly distinct from magic. And yet they were very, very playable. You could run them. They weren't impossible for the average story guide to run. And I think it's the most brilliant single idea that I have seen for a supplement in my entire time of running Ars Magica, which is very high praise because there have been a lot of brilliant ideas. I know some people don't like the new version of fairies, and it must be admitted that I used to like Merinita Magi back in earlier editions, but I sort of went off them with the new version of fairies because the stories I wanted to tell with them didn't fit with the new version of fairies. So I can see why people might not like it, but it's fantastic. It just hits everything and you can do it.
To be fair, if you wanted to use the mechanics, you could still largely, I think, run the old John Sneed courts and do it that way if that was an issue for you.
Yes.
Now, more controversial would be the take on House Creamon. And I think the issue there Timothy had was because he was nailing down chamber pots. And before, House Creamon and the Enigma were never really adequately defined in any way. And this was the danger for authors. As soon as you define something, players don't like it. Some, a vocal minority. And as line editor, you must have got that.
Oh, yes. We got that. The people who didn't like it. There is actually a joke about nailing down chamber pots in one of the books.
The Warders of Mystery, whose symbols are nailed down chamber pots. Yes.
Yeah. Well, the chamber pots and the nail, not actually nailed down.
Okay.
But yes, we did get that. Although sometimes we could work around it. I mean, Mark Faulkner was a very vocal opponent of the new take on Flambeau and saying how it was terrible and ruined everything. And then we got him to work on the Provençal Tribunal and write the 5th edition version of Val Negra. And he's now happy with it because he's figured out a way to make it all work a way he likes within the constraints of 5th edition and got that into canon. So you can win over the vocal critics sometimes, but yes.
Also, the nailing down chamber pots, Kev created a Rago Terram spell that put a nail through the bottom of a chamber pot, and it was designed for their shipboard Covenant, so that in storms the chamber pots would not spill. I think somebody else. Then there was the great debate of whether human excrement was corpus or terram. I ruled it was terram, but it was just a great moment in my campaign. So
some of the debates in Ars Magica are interesting.
Yeah, I still remember my analysis of the 4th edition combat system, which you went on to look at and discovered that it was the best policy was in fact similar to my friend who came round while I was writing it, i.e. nakedness and sticks, I believe, came into it, didn't
Yeah,
they?
yeah. Because of
Yeah,
the way the numbers added up, you would take more damage the heavier the armor you were wearing was.
yeah. So a fully armored knight would always be defeated by a naked picked arm with a long stick. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the stick was actually one of the best possible weapons again because of the way the numbers added up. The 4th edition combat system was really bad.
What was the basis for Rune, the RPG?
But that's all right because it's not like Rune is fundamentally based on. Hang on a minute. Never mind. Yes, moving swiftly on.
No, Rune actually is one of those games that people every few years decide to run at Grand Tribunal, and they run it, and then we don't see them again. It's got a reputation as being run once, and then the person who ran it never returns.
Yeah, well,
but it's still.
My fault.
No, I've run it a few times and enjoyed it. It's an interesting game. So, by 5th edition, by the end of it, you must have been pretty sick of it. Have you played it since?
No, I did in fact pretty much completely move away from Ars Magica once I stopped line editing, which was one of the reasons I stopped, because I could feel that coming on towards the end, that I had been deeply involved with Ars Magica for 20 years. The first thing I wrote for it is in the 3rd edition Wizard's Grimoire. Actually, the first thing I wrote for it is an article in White Wolf magazine, which was written for 2nd edition, but wasn't actually published until 3rd edition had come out. So the stats really don't work with the edition that was current. And it actually set up part of the background for the technocracy in the World of Darkness.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because they didn't actually buy all rights to it. They only bought first serial rights.
So you own the technocracy.
I own the foundation myth of the technocracy, strictly speaking. But it's just really cool, so I'm not actually bothered about that.
No. It's just nice that you created that.
Yes. My first published role-playing thing has been rather more influential than it possibly should have been.
I never actually played Mage, strangely enough, which is, I just seem to have this curse with the World of Darkness that I never. But I do own an awful lot of books for it. So where was I? I was going to ask you one more question that sprung to my mind. Oh, actually, I'm currently one of our covenants in our campaign, which actually has been paused since my mother's death. My dear old mum died a month ago, and it's led to me taking a short break from running as many games. Is with people who played with you at Cambridge. I have a group of players, and not the ones who went on to write for Ars. So I don't know if you were aware of that. I'm actually playing with I think there's 4 or 5 of them who played in your saga in Cambridge and who are now, for the first time in many years, playing online with me at the moment. So
4 or 5, that's most of the saga.
Well, there's people like, I won't name names on here, but yeah, I can message you afterwards and tell you who's involved.
Who it is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure most of them said that they played with you at university and that's how they got involved. So
that would be quite possible. There was someone on the Atlas forums. It turns out he got involved with Ars Magica through the demo for 4th edition that I ran in the game shop in Cambridge.
Okay.
4th edition came out. So
no, well, these are Cambridge mathematicians and Cambridge lecturers, from what I can work out. So they've stayed in Cambridge, so you might know who they are.
I might know who they are.
Yes.
I certainly should know who they are. My memory's not that bad.
I don't know. Well, you've been in Japan a long time now, haven't you?
I have. It's a very long time. Let's moving swiftly on from that topic.
Really? Okay. So,
yeah.
Okay. it's lovely that you're being able to join us today, and it's really nice to talk again because it's been a long time since we actually had a conversation. I'm sorry that you've left the unprofitable business of role-playing games, but
Not
I do hope.
necessarily left it permanently, but yeah,
I think structurally, actually, that must have been one of the issues towards the end of ours, was that kind of RPG is no longer being produced, really, is it? Everybody's moved over to a Kickstarter general crowdfunding model.
yes, and it's either nostalgia or a very different approach to the games. So I know that towards the end of the line, because John Nephew told me this, that it probably wasn't economically viable.
No.
But since I'd said, produce this plan, okay, we'll do this and then we'll close it off, he said, right, we will keep going until you leave and then we will look at it.
And there is the long tail. There are people who are still hunting down the books. There are people who are still buying. And while the books are still in print, and they are, I think, all still in print.
I think they are all still in print, which is, yeah.
Yeah. And some of them in paperback now, but they are all still in print and they're still selling. So I think for many, many, many years to come, the sales will exceed the warehousing. And even then, there will be the electronic PDFs. There will be, they will be available.
Yeah, and I think it does well on Bundle of Holding when it goes on there.
So. It does, and it's been on there 4 times now, I think, hasn't it? Or 3 times?
Yeah, I think it has. Yeah, I think actually the whole of 5th edition has now been on Bundle of Holding.
And it is a game. Not all of it. I'm not sure if all of it has. I think there are some books that haven't, but it's definitely a game that is aspirational for many role players. They want to play it one day. They are determined. They love the concept, or they're interested in it, and then they settle down and try and create a character. And at that point, it all goes wrong. Do you think character generation is too complex, or obviously not because you designed it? But can you see that why it's off-putting?
Yes, I think character generation probably is too complex. Ars Magica is probably too front-loaded. You have to understand the game too well before you create your first character, or it will go horribly wrong.
But if it goes horribly wrong, it might go horribly wrong in an entertaining story-wise.
Yes, it might go horribly wrong in an entertaining way. If you're creating a Magus in Ars Magica, it is very difficult to create a boring character. It's easy to create a character that can't actually do what you were planning to do, but it's very hard to make a character that is actually boring. But I don't think the problems that Ars Magica has can be fixed while leaving it still as Ars Magica with all the things that make it great. I think they are a feature of the whole approach to the game. If I were writing a role-playing game now, it would take a very different approach from Ars Magica, but it wouldn't be Ars Magica, and I still think Ars Magica is fantastic. The 5th edition is absolutely in general. I really liked the game, which is why I worked on it for 25 years. So.
Yeah. And I think the 5th edition, the people who stuck with it are obviously those who like the 5th edition and who think it's the best game ever. And those who don't probably still play 1st, 2nd, or 3rd ed, as there are still campaigns going on. I don't think
there are still campaigns going on for at least 3rd edition. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever come across anyone running 4th still.
No, I think 5th edition is essentially the fixed version of 4th edition. So if you liked 4th edition, you moved to 5th edition because it fixed all the problems. But if you liked 3rd edition, there are enough differences that you might not want to move to 5th. Yeah.
So an example of why I think it is one of the greatest games of all time, this might amuse you. We were running a game this week. A group of Magi came to Andover, medieval Andover, and were camping outside and hiding themselves from the companions. Went in and discovered that a burgher's wife was having one of the prosperous guildsman's wife was having a difficult pregnancy, was trying to deliver twins, and had developed what in modern terms would be called eclampsia. And so they went and fetched the Magi one of whom actually was a specialist in fertility magic, and we did a 2.5-hour session about the birth of twins, and the rules cover it. And I do not think, in fact, I don't think there's been a fight for about 4 or 5 sessions at least. Fight combat seems to be very uncommon, but there are not many role-playing games where you could do a story where the central problem is the fact that a youngish woman is suffering from complications in childbirth. There are questions of whether or not that would be wise to run with many people anyway, and I probably wouldn't if the players hadn't explicitly signaled that's what they wanted to do, for the same reason that I leave the death of infants out of my games, and I leave other things that I think are emotional hot button topics out of my games, because we all know people. But, you know, if the players...
Yes.
But if the players signal, and that is one of the great things about the virtue system, it's one of the great things about the way in which the game develops and the characters research their own magic and invent spells, because they can suggest to you, this is something that we are interested in. And the fact that 2 members of my troupe chose to take spells relating to childbirth suggested to me that they wanted to do stories about childbirth and midwifery.
Yeah, makes sense.
Which is not what you would expect of the Cheltenham players, really, but there you go. Maybe they got tired of bothering dragons and blowing up giants, and now
we will help them to give birth safely.
They actually secretly all wanted to be midwives, it seems. So there you go. Anyway,
yes, Ars Magica is supposed to be able to handle non-combat sagas where the main conflicts are not about combat. One of the scenarios in Hooks is basically a knight comes to the Covenant and wants to challenge the evil wizards, and the response to that from some people was, but you can easily defeat him, he's a mundane, he's dead. So yeah, that's not the point. He's a knight, he's the son of a local noble. If you kill him, you have really serious problems. The point is, how do you deal with him, not can you defeat him in combat? And that's the sort of story that Ars Magica is good at, and the player-driven stories is.
And it's a difficult thing to referee, because at times, if you're used to a D&D paradigm where you go into a room, you fight the monsters, you take the treasure, you move on. I'm not saying that's a bad one, because I actually ran Dungeons and Dragons for the first time in about 20 years and really enjoyed it recently. It was fun, and I'm glad I did it. But there's an emphasis on combat in a lot of the F20 games or D20 games. You're constantly rolling dice and attacking and fighting and moving on. And even wizards are basically heavy artillery that are brought out occasionally to do an airstrike, and then they move on. Not entirely. That's an unfair caricature. But
yes, combat is central.
It's central to the game. Combat is central, and recording hit points is central. That isn't the case, and if you're used to that, then it can be overwhelming when you suddenly realize that a single mage can, with a spell, take out a goodly group of bandits, archers, or even knights. You know, a single spell can be deadly.
Yes, a single spell can be deadly. The Transforming Mythic Europe book, I think it was Timothy's chapter about building an island on top of Dogger Bank, because it's really shallow, so it's quite easy to build it up. And there is a little note in there pointing out that you can actually do this straight out of apprenticeship. It will take you a bit of time to cast the spells, but this can be the first thing your Magus does.
Yep, exactly. So you could, for example, decide to create a massive island in the North Sea, and I suppose the Hanseatic League would be quite interested in that.
Yes, it would have interest. I think the note, if I remember right, it did go on to say, given the consequences, you might want to wait until you're not fresh out of apprenticeship, but you could do it.
To be fair, you could discover Lost Atlantis exactly as described by Plato, because you would simply recreate it 20 stadia, is it, across, and your circular island could follow, and then you could discover Atlantis and set yourself up as philosopher priests. Yep. And who would dare argue with the wisdom of Atlantis? That's what I would do.
Well, the other members of the Order of Hermes might argue with it.
Well, yeah, they're always getting annoyed and invoking this code thing, aren't they?
Yeah.
The most popular specialization has always been Code of Hermes loopholes.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much for talking to us today, and
You're welcome. I hope this is
I hope the
recorded.
passion for the game still comes through. It's recorded fine, and it's interesting, as I say, that we can actually use Zoom and talk for the first time for a very long time. But thank you very much, and I hope that in the future we'll hear much more of your back in the world of role playing.
Thank you, and I hope to talk to people live at various points during the Image from the Wizard tour.
Yeah, and this is very much an experiment. I declared it during Grand Tribunal, lost my mother, spent weeks organising house clearance and funerals and stuff, and then have had to put it together in a very short period of time. But the nice thing is that people have come forward and have said they will run games. And if people run games, that's all that matters, isn't it?
It will happen, yes. So I look forward to that.
And hopefully some in the time zones that you can join us for. Thank you very much indeed. Well,
thank you very much.
Stop the recording.